Hello, everyone. So what I want to talk about today is actually, it's a model of disaster response from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is the agency within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that leads public health efforts to advance the behavioral health of our nation. So if you go to the next slide, please, I'm going to walk you through a model that's really considering the social and emotional impact that communities typically experience during a disaster. And this may look and feel familiar to some of you who have weathered natural disasters like hurricanes in your councils or in the areas where you live. The specifics of each phase as I walk you through aren't as important as really just considering the overall patterns and how people tend to react, respond, emotionally experience natural disasters. And really the point here is to think of how important it is to understand the emotional experience as we plan for the future and understand how our members, our communities, and of course our future members might be experiencing this crisis. And on the next slide, so I am going to talk you through this model, but on the next slide I'll also talk through some ways that the current state, if we go back please to the past slide, I'll talk through some ways that the current state might be a little bit different than the typical model. So this typical disaster recovery model, we're looking at emotional highs or positive emotions towards the top. That will be the high end of the curve, and emotional lows or more negative emotions towards the bottom side of the curve. So typically this would begin in a pre-disaster phase, which is characterized by fear and uncertainty. Perhaps you're seeing a disaster on the horizon and feeling vulnerable or a lack of security. And then that would move into the impact phase. And the impact phase is when the disaster hits, and this can be characterized by a range of emotions ranging from shock to panic to confusion to disbelief. Often communities are really focused in that moment on self-preservation or preservation or protecting their families. And so in the phase of impact, which some of us are in right now when we consider this virus, it really is about mitigating and responding to prepare ourselves as much as we can, and at the movement level, of course, preparing our volunteers or preempting and offering support to weather the storm. So in all of our councils, we're either somewhere in this impact phase or starting to move past it, though certainly this has happened at different times, you know, as we think of the relative impact of density on the coronavirus as we're seeing in LA or New York. But so if we move past the impact phase, the typical model is that we move into what's called the heroic phase. And so you're seeing here an upswing in affect and people feeling more positive. And the heroic phase is characterized by a high level of activity, but a low level of productivity. So people are feeling a strong sense of altruism. They're really wanting to help. There's increased positive emotions. You might see some of this with the sort of the nightly cheering that's happening right now that's really heartening for supporting our healthcare workers and those on the front lines. But sometimes there's also this kind of adrenaline-induced rescue behavior without really doing a clear, well-thought-out risk assessment or future planning. And so the goal here, if we're in this phase, is to channel the desire to act into something that is pro-social and productive, while also understanding that this might not apply to everyone at the same time. And then this heroic phase moves into the honeymoon phase where, you know, emotions are high, people are feeling optimistic that everything will return to normal quickly. Often disaster assistance is available. And this often presents an opportunity for organizations to build relationships with stakeholders. There might be a strong sense of community bonding. But then there often is this downswing in affect, this disillusionment phase where communities and individuals are realizing the limits of that assistance and the real need that remains for help. Stress might be taking a toll as folks realize that there is a real need for additional support and services. And then the last phase in the typical model is reconstruction, really recovery. It's an overall feeling of recovery, folks adjusting to the new normal as communities begin to understand and rebuild their lives. Now, if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about how that model doesn't fit perfectly for the current situation. The stages might still apply, but what is different is that this won't be such a clean linear process because the pandemic that we're in doesn't have a clean beginning, middle, and end point the same way that other typical disasters do. When a hurricane hits or tornado hits, it can be disastrous for that area, but it often passes quickly and then recovery can begin. So where we are in the curve of the virus really is going to vary from place to place, and people might be cycling through multiple phases of it at different times. Of course, that said, there's still going to be commonalities in how everyone is experiencing this. You know, the stress of social distancing, potentially feelings of grief, and also on the positive side, a stronger sense of community, of wanting to lean in, those feelings of altruism and wanting to help, even while being physically distant. And when we think of recovery, we really should be imagining a rolling recovery. Even understanding that the point at which we can all leave our houses freely, stop social distancing, does not mean a full return to normalcy. And so we think that this will be potentially a rolling recovery happening in stages, while also being a longer and more elongated climb back to normalcy. So this might happen by region, by city, by state. There might just be a slower return to a feeling of safety because we are now aware of our own vulnerability, and also there is the real risk of potential resurgence for viral infection. So it is harder to say that the crisis is done because of that potential rolling impact. Of course, also we have to consider the national economic impact and the slower climb to recovery that might cause. So in considering the new normal and when and how we're getting there, some experts in psychology are talking about national rates of a kind of PTSD and a national grieving similar to what was seen after the SARS epidemic, but potentially much larger. And so, knowing this and knowing the criticality and the importance of really addressing positive mental health in a time like this, we're continuing to introduce these topics in our content pieces for Raising Awesome Girls and Tips for Troop Leaders. We know that some councils are also working on mental health series for their members. And so I just want to call out that we do know that attention to positive mental health in this time is really important, and we're going to continue thinking about and providing resources for our members, and of course also for you. On an upcoming council call, we're going to try and bring in a mental health expert to talk about what this might mean, what the impacts might be for you and your staff, and have an opportunity to do a Q&A with an expert on this topic. I'll also just say that the real silver lining that we are seeing in this is this desire to be more connected, to make an impact, to do good in the world. And we know that these are all things that Girl Scouts is really good at and that we've been doing for a really long time. And so really leaning into that space can be really positive, both for our own mental health and, of course, for the strength of our movement as well.